There's something fascinating happening right now that most people aren't paying attention to, and it might just reshape the entire Middle Eastern chessboard in ways we haven't seen since the 1979 revolution. Donald Trump just issued what can only be described as one of his most pointed warnings yet to Iran, threatening very traumatic consequences if a nuclear deal doesn't materialize. Now, before you dismiss this as just another piece of political theater, consider what's actually at stake here. We're talking about a nation that's been under sanctions for decades, a regime that's weathered every storm the West has thrown at it, and suddenly, we're seeing this language of potential catastrophe. But here's what makes this moment so critical. This isn't happening in isolation. The global order is shifting beneath our feet. Russia and China are recalibrating their alliances. The petrodollar system is showing cracks, and the United States is clearly trying to re-establish dominance in a region that's increasingly slipping from its grasp. So what does Trump's warning really mean? What are the mechanisms at play here? And more importantly, what are the consequences for all of us if this situation goes sideways? Let's break this down. Now, to understand what's really happening here, we need to step back from the headlines and look at the actual architecture of power that's been built around Iran over the past 4 decades. Because this isn't just about nuclear weapons, it never really was. It's about control, it's about resources, and it's about maintaining a particular global order that benefits certain players while keeping others perpetually on the outside looking in. Trump's warning about very traumatic consequences isn't coming from nowhere. It's the latest move in a game that's been playing out since the Iranian Revolution fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Middle East. Let's be honest about something that rarely gets discussed in mainstream analysis. Iran sits on some of the world's largest proven oil and natural gas reserves. We're talking about a nation that controls critical shipping lanes through the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes every single day. This isn't a minor player we're discussing. This is a country that, despite decades of sanctions, despite being economically strangled by Western powers, has managed to maintain its sovereignty and actually expand its regional influence. That fact alone should tell you something about the nature of this conflict. This isn't about a rogue state trying to build weapons of mass destruction. This is about a nation that refuses to bend the knee to the Western-dominated international order, and that refusal has consequences. When Trump talks about traumatic consequences, we need to decode what that actually means in practical terms. Is he talking about military action, economic warfare that goes beyond anything we've seen before, regime change operations? Or is this simply negotiating leverage? The kind of hardball tactics that Trump has become famous for, where you threaten maximum pressure to get the other side to the table? The answer is probably all of the above, depending on how Iran responds. But here's what's crucial to understand. The United States doesn't have the same freedom of action it had 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. The world has changed. The unipolar moment is over, whether Washington wants to admit it or not. Think about the context we're operating in right now. China has brokered a historic reconciliation between Iran and Saudi Arabia, two regional rivals who were at each other's throats for years. That diplomatic achievement didn't come from the United States. It didn't come from the European Union. It came from Beijing, and it fundamentally altered the strategic landscape of the Middle East. Russia has deepened its ties with Iran, particularly in military and energy sectors. Iran has become a crucial player in Russia's strategy to circumvent Western sanctions, and Moscow has reciprocated by providing Tehran with advanced military technology and diplomatic cover at the United Nations. These aren't minor developments. These are tectonic shifts in global power dynamics. So when Trump issues warnings about traumatic consequences, he's not speaking from a position of overwhelming strength the way an American president might have in 1991 or even 2003. He's speaking from a position where the United States is trying to reassert dominance in a region that's increasingly operating according to different rules, and Iran knows this. Tehran's leadership isn't stupid. They've been playing this game for 45 years. They understand leverage. They understand timing. And they understand that the global balance of power is shifting in ways that might, for the first time in decades, work in their favor. But let's talk about what a nuclear deal actually means in this context, because the terminology itself is often misleading. When we hear nuclear deal, most people think we're talking about preventing Iran from building nuclear weapons. And sure, that's part of it, but the real issue at stake is Iran's position in the global economy and the international system. A nuclear deal means sanctions relief. It means Iran can sell oil on international markets without the constant threat of American secondary sanctions punishing anyone who buys from them. It means Iranian banks can reconnect to the global financial system. It means billions of dollars in frozen assets get released. In other words, a nuclear deal means Iran gets to participate in the global economy as a normal nation, and that's what this has always been about. The original Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA that Obama negotiated and Trump withdrew from, wasn't perfect by any stretch, but it represented a fundamental shift in approach. It acknowledged that Iran wasn't going to be regime changed or bombed into submission. It accepted that diplomacy and engagement might be more effective than perpetual hostility, and for a brief window, it looked like the relationship might normalize. Iranian moderates felt vindicated. Young Iranians who wanted their country to rejoin the international community felt hopeful. European companies started making deals, and then Trump pulled out, reimposed sanctions, and pursued what his administration called maximum pressure. Now, here's where it gets interesting from an analytical standpoint. Maximum pressure was supposed to bring Iran to its knees. It was supposed to create so much internal discontent that either the regime would collapse or they'd come begging for a better deal. Neither happened. Iran did suffer economically, there's no question about that. Inflation skyrocketed, the currency collapsed. Ordinary Iranians faced real hardship, but the regime didn't fall. If anything, the hardliners were strengthened because they could point to American aggression as validation of their worldview. The reformists who had championed engagement were discredited, and Iran accelerated its nuclear program beyond where it had been under the JCPOA, enriching uranium to levels much closer to weapons-grade material. So Trump's current warning about traumatic consequences comes after his first approach didn't achieve its stated objectives. And that raises a fundamental question. What makes anyone think that more threats, more pressure, more potential violence will work now when it didn't work then? Unless, of course, the actual goal isn't to prevent Iran from having nuclear weapons, but to maintain a state of managed crisis that justifies continued military presence in the region, continued defense spending, and continued control over Middle Eastern energy resources. Now, I'm not saying that's definitely the case, but it's worth considering as a possibility when we analyze the patterns of behavior over decades. Let's also talk about what traumatic might mean in practical military terms, because this isn't abstract. If the United States were to launch military strikes against Iran's nuclear facilities, we're not talking about a quick surgical operation. Iran's nuclear program is dispersed across multiple sites, some of them hardened and buried deep underground. Destroying these facilities would require sustained air campaigns, possibly including bunker-buster munitions, and even then, success isn't guaranteed. And Iran wouldn't just sit there and take it. They have the capability to strike back against American bases in the region, against American allies, and most critically, against the global oil supply by mining or blockading the Strait of Hormuz. Imagine what happens to global oil prices if 20% of the world's supply suddenly can't get through that narrow waterway. We're not talking about a minor disruption, we're talking about an economic shock that would reverberate through every economy on the planet. Gas prices in the United States would skyrocket, inflation, which is already a concern, would explode, global supply chains would face another massive disruption, and that's assuming the conflict remains limited to strikes on nuclear facilities and Iranian retaliation against shipping. If this escalates into a broader regional war, if Israel gets directly involved, if Hezbollah opens a front from Lebanon, if Iranian proxies throughout Iraq and Syria and Yemen all activate simultaneously, then we're looking at a conflict that could dwarf anything we've seen in the region since the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. And here's something that should terrify anyone paying attention. We're having this conversation at the moment when the world is already on edge. Ukraine is still burning. Relations between the United States and China are at their lowest point in decades. The global financial system is showing signs of serious stress. Adding a major Middle Eastern war to this mix isn't just dangerous, it's potentially catastrophic. Yet somehow, we keep inching closer to exactly that scenario, and most people aren't even aware of how precarious the situation has become. Now, let's consider Iran's perspective for a moment, because understanding their calculus is essential to predicting what happens next. From Tehran's point of view, they've already made concessions. They negotiated the JCPOA in good faith. They allowed international inspectors unprecedented access to their facilities. They drastically reduced their uranium stockpiles and dismantled centrifuges. And what did they get in return? A few years of partial sanctions relief before the United States unilaterally withdrew and reimposed even harsher sanctions. So when Trump or anyone else demands that Iran come back to the negotiating table, the Iranian response is entirely predictable. Why should we trust you? What guarantee do we have that any new deal won't be discarded the moment a different president takes office? This is a fundamental problem that goes beyond Trump or Biden or whoever occupies the White House. It's about the credibility of American commitments in international agreements. If the United States can simply walk away from treaties whenever politically convenient, why would any adversary invest in diplomacy? Why wouldn't they instead pursue deterrence through actual weapons development? And that's exactly what we're seeing. Iran has learned that the only language American power truly respects is strength, weakness, conciliation, good faith negotiation. None of that protected them, so they've adjusted their strategy accordingly. But there's another layer to this that often gets overlooked in the analysis. Iran isn't operating in a vacuum. They're watching how the United States treats other nations. They saw what happened to Libya when Gaddafi gave up his weapons programs and tried to normalize relations with the West. He ended up dead, and his country descended into chaos. They saw what happened to Iraq after Saddam was toppled. Another country destroyed, millions killed or displaced, still unstable decades later. And they're seeing what's happening to Russia right now, a nuclear-armed power being subjected to unprecedented sanctions because they dared to challenge Western expansion into their sphere of influence. Every one of these examples reinforces the same lesson: surrender your sovereignty, and you become vulnerable. Maintain your deterrent capability, and you might survive. So when we talk about what Trump's warning means, we have to understand it in this broader context of nations trying to navigate a world where the old rules are breaking down but new rules haven't been established yet. The United States still acts as if it's the sole superpower that can dictate terms to everyone else, but that reality is eroding fast. Iran, Russia, China, they're all probing the limits of American power, testing whether Washington can actually enforce its will the way it used to, and increasingly the answer seems to be that it can't, at least not without costs that might be politically unsustainable. This brings us to perhaps the most important question. What does all of this mean for ordinary Americans, for people who just want to live their lives without getting dragged into another Middle Eastern conflict? It means you need to understand that the decisions being made right now in Washington could have profound consequences for your daily life. It means that the price you pay at the gas pump, the stability of your retirement investments, the question of whether your sons and daughters might be sent to fight in another war, all of these things are connected to the confrontation brewing with Iran, and it means you should be asking hard questions about whether the path we're on actually serves American interests or whether it serves a much narrower set of interests that benefit from permanent conflict and instability. Because here's the thing that rarely gets said openly. There are powerful constituencies in Washington and beyond who profit enormously from Middle Eastern chaos. Defense contractors who sell weapons to everyone involved. Oil companies who benefit from price spikes caused by supply disruptions. Financial firms who make money on volatility. Geopolitical think tanks funded by these interests who constantly advocate for aggressive policies. These aren't conspiracy theories. These are documented facts about how power and money flow in our system. And if you're not aware of these dynamics, you're not really understanding why we keep ending up in the same patterns of conflict, despite decades of evidence that these approaches don't actually solve problems. Trump's warning to Iran isn't happening in isolation. It's part of a much larger story about American decline, about the rise of multipolarity, about the desperate attempts to maintain hegemony in a world that's moving beyond the post-Cold War order. Whether that warning leads to diplomacy or disaster depends on choices that will be made in the coming weeks and months. And those choices will be influenced by whether enough people are paying attention, asking questions, and demanding that their leaders pursue policies that actually serve the interests of peace and prosperity rather than the interests of perpetual conflict. That's what this moment is really about, and that's why you need to understand what's at stake when you hear those words about traumatic consequences. Because trauma, once unleashed, doesn't stay confined to faraway places. It comes home. It always does.